Hello!
Hello!
So, glad you guys could make it. I'm Aaron. Chris.
I'm Chris. Howdy.
You guys have met both of us before. We've done our talk before, but it's been a while. And we kind of wanted to go talk to you guys about specifically what we have been working on this last month, roughly. We ended up getting some outside input on what we were working on, and came to the realization that what we thought we had nailed down as a style wasn't as nailed down as we thought.
Right.
So ultimately, that's what we get to talk about today.
So specifically, I think we're talking about one global style guide, right, what you've got here,
yep,
as well, and then kind of more specifically, we're going to see most of this in the exterior spaces.
Yes.
Okay.
This is primarily we're going to go over our process of how we ended up looking at what we already had and figuring out from there what we could nail down as what we want for our style for the game.
Yeah. And
then from there we went and ended up from there how we ended up coming up with a couple of guidelines. And for now we're talking about the general guidelines. We're not going to get into a bunch of details. It's about a 12-page document that came out of this whole process. Thus, we aren't going to share the whole entire thing with you. It would be much longer than an hour, much longer than what we have time for.
Yeah. And I think the thing that you pointed to is this isn't that there's a huge change in the style of the game. What it is especially we started to ask outside people of their feedback, we realized that there was an internal conversation that had never really been written down or codified in a way that was convenient to share with someone outside. And so if you wanted to hire another artist and he would say, well, what are the style guides for here? You would have these long rambling conversations that it all needed to be tightened up is what it comes down to.
It's actually the main reason why we had to ask ourselves, why do we need a style guide? It's important. And that's exactly one of the reasons is that earlier on, we had a big direction. We all knew we wanted to head north, but we didn't exactly have a specific location on our map of this is hitting the correct mark.
Yeah.
We weren't even internally. We weren't all on the same page.
Right.
We thought we were, but we hadn't had discussions that really got really deep into what we wanted to do. We had to ask ourselves, why do we want to do this versus this instead of why and why shouldn't we, or why should we? And then like Chris said, if we had a new person come in, which is part of what happened, is we had these we asked for feedback on some stuff, and they had these conflicting pieces that were like, wait, we don't have a solid style guide to go with. We don't have a solid, internally, we don't have something to lean on. So we can very easily be leaves blowing in the wind.
Yeah. But I think it was a whole exercise in discipline, and in, it's easy for art style to be kind of like you eyeball it and you say, well, that's the right color. And especially Aaron's got a great sort of just eyeball for that kind of stuff. But that's different for someone who doesn't have either the same eyeball or the same kind of personal style. So it was a discipline question. I thought was really good.
What we learned how to do specifically through this process is how to verbalize and communicate without having it being I know one of the things I have issues with is I have a good idea and a good sense for what to do. I just can't verbalize it very well. There was a lot of Aaron, why this? Aaron, why this? It's like, right, I can answer your question once you ask it. I just can't come up with a question to myself.
It's a huge deal. And
it wasn't just me.
And I'd say I'm tinkering with the idea, and I'm leaning towards being, once this is done and wrapped up, that we'll probably share it with the audience for anyone who's interested. It's it's geeky stuff, but I think people would be interested. So
yeah, I don't see why we wouldn't. Like other studios have shared their guides before. It was one of the things we did as research during this was how have other people set up? What language do they use? How can we use this as a basis to model our own after? So from here, so we had to discuss where we start. So we looked at mood words, which was as a conversation as a whole company. We thought of Redwall and Mossflower Forest, and thought of what are the mood words. What is the goal of how we want this place to feel? And the goal was to have these general words that specifically would be able to apply to the styling and the visual style, and then we'd be able to model our visual styling after part of the visual styling and create these guidelines and these rules that would help us get towards these goals and these mood words.
Yeah.
The other thing we did is, I mentioned it before, but Chris really felt, or as we were starting into this, that we already had the style somewhere in our previous work. So we just had to go into these images and deconstruct and figure out what we liked and what we didn't like.
Yeah.
And I should say, it's not, when we were deconstructing these things, it wasn't about picking out what was good and bad about these images, because they aren't good or bad. It's about what we wanted to keep and keep moving forward with, and what we didn't want to keep and not move forward with.
Right. It's kind of a single noise question.
Yeah. And so that we had to make sure we were looking at these images not about personal likes or dislikes, but what would work. And also, what could we take from these images? What could we learn from them and apply it to other images and other things? Like, could we learn something from... one of the things that we actually ended up doing was we learned from a texture, a lot of different guidelines that we pulled from that, a lot of guidelines that we wanted to apply to objects and to the environment, and we'll get to that. So first off, I'm going to start off with our mood words. These were these were some of our mood words that we came up with and we recorded. The major ones I have the little stars next to them and are in italics. Very specifically, we wanted our general and environmental space, specifically the forest area, to feel wild. We wanted everything to feel very layered. We wanted textures to feel intricate and elegant, and our objects to feel playful and chubby. And when I say chubby, it's not that we want them to feel fat or like how these stout, or these words say stout, but I'm thinking of these tall, thin structures versus structures or objects. Instead, we wanted them to start feeling a little bit thicker. We actually, from the word chubby, and also a little bit later, we actually pulled from this, we came up with a guideline that we're calling chubbier than reality. Yeah. And in that sense, it's that if you have this thin, delicate line, or a thinner, like even on a table, like the leg might be thinner than you would actually expect, or in reality, but in our game, we want to thicken that up slightly, just making things a little bit, giving them a little bit more oomph. Like
more weight, more stability.
More weight and stability.
Yeah.
And that's what we mean by chubby. So it's not, and we also we have the words chubby and chunky up there. That actually became chubby sounds softer than chunky does.
Yeah. Now you left off the gritty conversation. I think we're going to talk about that later.
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll hold my tongue.
Remind me to come back to that.
Okay.
Because I completely forgot to add it in here. I meant to put it in here and I forgot to.
Okay. So we'll get to that.
Yes. So coming into this, we had a bunch of different imagery that we wanted to use. We took from, and I pulled from the biggest pieces of conversation, and we had a bunch of conversations called Deconstruct This. So looking at these two images that you see, the one on the right, actually both of these are done by an artist named Nat Iwata. He used to work for us, and we're still good. We're still in contact and friends with him. He's a great guy. And we have these two different images, and the biggest thing that we were looking at with these is the one on the right feels flatter, and part of that comes down to the outlines used. The one on the left has a little bit more depth, and part of that is that the figures there don't have any outlines. And specifically, it's actually that they don't have outlines. It's that they don't have these dark outlines. They have these two-toned color-rimmed lighting, which is a common feel for 3D modeling. Mm-hmm. For not just 3D modeling, but artists who work in a 2D format that want to make something feel like it has 3D. They give an object a light or rim light, or like they become backlit is actually I think the word that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. And you really see it really well on the Badger and on the mouse. But because there's these two different light sources, the blue light and the yellow light, it starts to make it feel it gives it a lot more depth. And that's something that we're realizing. It's not that we're against outlines, which outlines start to feel very illustrative. And it's not that we don't want that look. It's that we don't want the flat look of the darker outlines.
Right.
So
we talked about and for history, the image on the right, the mole poster, was something that Nat did really, really early on. Like when we very first thought that we might get a chance to work on this, when we were doing the Kickstarter campaign, mm-hmm. He was working on this image. So it's a very early version of some things. And the next one, the one at the table, that's probably 2 or 3 years later. And so I think a lot of the artistic conversation had shifted and changed. And actually, he just did that on his own. It wasn't actually even part of the project. There's a couple things also. The flatness is a big deal. Can I talk about scale?
Go ahead.
Something that shows up, and this is actually a really difficult thing, and people ask us a lot about this question of scale. And it's well known that the author was very deliberately coy on this question. People would be like, how big is a mouse really? And he would say something like, well, however big you want it to be, or however big it is in your imagination, which is great in a book when you don't have anything to say, or rather to see. But once you put it in 3D, now everything is in relation to everything else, and so you can't get away with that. So that said, this image here on the left, what's interesting about it is the variety of scale, from the small mouse to the medium hare to the big badger. And we are really trying to have this world that encompasses a range of scales of the characters that still looks like they all live in the same world. And so it's not easy to do, quite frankly. It causes all kinds of headaches for how you build assets and everything else. But we have been consistently trying to get this space. And ideally, if we can have that moment where you play an environment as a mouse and everything looks big, but then maybe at another chance you come back and you see that environment as a hare, now it looks smaller. And it's that thing like when you come to a place that you last saw as a child, there's that universal experience of like, well, wow, this is a lot smaller than I remember. So anyways, that scale piece is a huge part of the look, and it's not exactly an artistic thing, but it's a big piece of how everything fits together. It
was actually one of the things that we figured out before we had this conversation was we gave ourselves a guideline for the scale of the creatures, and and that when we've talked about this before, that the mice that we're measuring things in mice roughly, and that a hare is 2 mice tall and a badger is 3 mice tall, and that was one of those that's one of the first guidelines I would say we got written down for everyone to figure out. And part of it is because that was one of the first things we actually had people outside the office working on, and outside of our internal dialogue that was happening here. So we needed to have it written down earlier on.
But I think the politically correct term is mices.
Mices?
I think so.
Did I say mices?
You said mice.
Oh. Well, okay then. Whatever. So basically what this came down to was we figured out from these 2 pieces what we liked about outlines and how we wanted to pull that into other things. So coming on, then we moved on to some other imagery. These 2 are similar, but then stylistically different. But what we like about both of them is how there's this lighter background versus a darker foreground. Yeah. We like how there's a use of light to guide the viewer through the image. Like there's this distinct path that has lighting on the ground. The left one is a little bit more obvious because all of the things kind of point to the center. But the one on the right, you start getting this you start having the whole environment starts pointing towards slightly off to the right where those posts are. Yeah. And
something I love about the image on the right is it really reflects that notion of dappling as well, where you see these on and off spotty colors. Yep. And so in this case, you can imagine in a snow scene, one way that you might do snow is just this huge blanket that covers everything, which is kind of cool, but it's also relatively boring. Yep. Visually, the idea of more of a dusting where the snow sort of is obviously present, but it's not this blanket that covers everything, just turns it white. I think that's a lot more visually interesting, that shows a lot more depth and color and variation. Yeah, and you start getting, you start feeling like there's more to the space. Yeah. So like that was some of the things that we got out of these 2 images. I was like, we can pull those from these 2 images and keep it in others, and I can move it into this other space and how we want to progress. Then we have this other image. This one was done by Jeremy. The last 2, the one on the left was done by me, and the one on the right was also done by Jeremy. Yeah. But in this piece, the biggest thing that we learned from this one was layers. Yeah, layers are a huge deal, and so when we there's a place nearby here called Tillicum, and it's an outdoor camp for like Boy Scouts, that kind of thing. Specifically, it's like a day camp for kids. Yeah. And we're not talking about Tillicum, the town. Is there a town, Tillicum? Cheese? That's Tillamook. Tillamook, sorry. Tillicum versus Tillamook. So anyways, one of the things you see a lot at Tillicum is that, and it's true about all of this sort of like west of the Cascades here in Oregon, is that there's like so much biodiversity. Like every place that there is available dirt, something's going to grow, and it's all over the place. It's different shades of green, it's different shades of brown and red and gold, and it's just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And we felt that this image was a great example of that, of foreground, midground, distance, and different layers are very distinct against one another. So you can see the individual fronds, the individual blades, sort of in the silhouette, not just sort of in the foreground, which is really, frankly, a nice way to make the difference.
Yep. Like, it was something that I'm going to just leave it at that. That's a really good way of summarizing it. So then we come down, I've mentioned earlier that we had a texture that we pulled a lot from. Initially, we didn't have this texture as a part of our deconstruct these different images thing. And then Chris pulled it up and was like, guys, I feel like this is really important to deconstruct this specific piece.
Yeah.
So we're looking at it. And one of the things we like is that there's a variation in the line width. We also like that it's weaving in and out inside of itself. It feels, and also starts to feel organic. And one of the things that this specific piece is a texture that is seamless, which means that if you put it right next to each other, it works into itself. It doesn't have a truly distinct border unless you force it to have one. So, and this is a bark texture created for a Douglas fir tree.
Yeah. So are we going to talk about kind of the growing around itself? Is that the right place? Okay.
This is the right place for that.
So there was this notion that we wanted to do, which is if ideally objects and textures and stuff from a distance could look pretty realistic, because we're reasonably realistic. So at least that your eye would go, oh, that's whatever. That's wood. That's rock. Whatever. But as you got closer and closer, they looked more and more crafted. There was this idea that fundamentally, if this is a world that looks like a piece of art as opposed to a purely natural texture, we thought that would be a nice way to stylize everything. And so in this texture, one of the things that I loved about it is you have this vague shape of the sort of the curlicue swirl, and everything else kind of grows around it, almost like the way that wood grain goes around a knot or a branch. And you can imagine, say, that a Celtic artist might see this image and from it be inspired to do the more traditional Celtic knots or the curves. So the idea that our natural textures could conceivably be the inspiration for more technical textures or designs from the Book of Kells or something like that. We thought that would be a nice place that could blend reality with stylization in a way that was identifiable and reproducible.
Other things that we identified in this was, like, we liked the variation in thickness, but we also, like, we discovered, like, hey, we talked about this fact that there's this kind of chubbier than reality piece, and it feels this is a really good example of that. Like, bark typically isn't this thick across in the distinguishing lines. It's usually a lot thinner, and especially like the spacing between it. There isn't so much darkness in between. Another thing that we found that we liked about this is the fact that there was no straight lines. And we thought that was, and when we said that, we realized that could be a really interesting, especially when we start playing it out into different pieces. Like, what if we don't have straight lines in this world? And I should say that this is a guideline. It's not a hard rule that we have to stick to. There's definitely going to be a couple of straight lines, but we didn't want these long, distinguishing straight lines without it being broken up somehow. And so we thought, and curves are one of the easiest ways to do that. So pulling out from this, we've mentioned a couple of things that we deconstructed from this specific image, and there was more that came out of it, but I think we'll get back to that later. But so we come out of this and we're thinking, well, how does deconstructing these things help us achieve where we want to go? Again, we're starting to get to the same page. We're starting to have an idea of where we wanted to land on our map. And so we started with that texture piece, and made this decision that all textures will have a distinct pattern that's visible within it. And we wanted to make sure that there was a distinguishing kind of knot that these textures grew out of, and we have some examples of these on the right. These are all works in progress. They're not completely done. You can see the column on the far right is actually a combination piece in the middle of the water and the rock riverbed below it. But both of those are these two distinguishing patterns. The water is the easiest pattern to identify. You see the swirls. In the dirt in the bottom left, there's actually there's a
bottom right.
No, bottom left. I'm looking at the dirt.
Oh, the dirt. Okay.
I'm trying to remember what the pattern was. What it's because it's not a swirl, but it does have an overlapping piece to it that kind of it has a circle in there that the rocks are kind of following as well. And then we have like the grass there and they all feel very organic. And the one that's probably going to stand out most to not adhering to this whole like organic feel is the rock wall at the top. And that's because it's broken up visually. It currently has, I'm going to just hand draw this with my hand if you guys can see it on your screen, but it goes like this. Kind of looks like a wave. It's a little bit like an ocean wave on it, but it's this underlying texture that we were realizing it's okay if these patterns get broken up as long as it's still identifiable.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the things that we also are playing with ice, breaking up the water texture.
There's something, if I can draw attention to the center one on the right, is the combination of the water and the riverbed. About a month ago, we posted an image on Facebook that included a water sort of ice river, and the swirl in the river was really strong in that image, partly because at that point it hadn't been filled in. Mm-hmm. But I think that the center image is really good to show. While these are kind of the guiding principles, in practice, when you start putting them together, a lot of that really high, kind of that super unreal fantasy look, that gets diminished quite a bit mm-hmm. in actual practice, because you dim the opacity, you dim the contrast, and so it doesn't look like crazy, like this isn't natural. Yeah. It doesn't look like that in practice.
And one of the things that we're talking about even is like you see the start of a grass texture here. Well, that grass texture has modeled grass on top of it, so it gets lost because there's this model actually breaking it up. The dirt is going to be the lowest layer of all these different textures or of different plants. It's going to have a bunch of plants breaking it up. None of these are going. The only one so far actually I can think of right now that's a solo piece basically is the bark texture. But even that's going to be wrapping around something, so it gets broken up visually. Yeah. Because it's never just there by its own. It's always it's going to be going around something because it's going around the trunk. Right. So that's something that we want to have this pattern distinguished. The other thing that we talked about earlier is the fact that there's no straight lines. And when we were talking about this, and you can see we started off with a box. Like the box is going to be everywhere, not everywhere, but we actually don't want it to be hey, we need to fill this space with something. Let's put a box.
Just throw some crates in there.
It's like, let's just throw in some crates. So we wanted to have something to make a box interesting, but also we started with the box for how we wanted to stylize our objects. And we talked about having soft corners. We wanted to reinforce the structural supports. Mm-hmm. So in this case, on a box, that's going to be the corners and the edges, basically. And so we thickened those up. And then we also added in some subtle bowing, distinctly thinking about no straight lines. And we also, one of the other things that we thought about with no straight lines, I'm going to quickly cover before moving on to the bridge, is the idea that our landscape won't be straight either. It's not going to be this big flat plane. Or even if you're within a canyon and the base won't be flat either. It's going to have these bumps and edges. We want there to be vertical and horizontal curving, not just horizontal.
The crate's such an interesting problem too, because it's the object one that is in every video game you can imagine, mm-hmm. but B, it also absolutely resists the rules that we want to use. And so if you can tame a cube to fit your rules, then that sort of proves a lot of points and really puts them into practice.
And so we have that kind of feel for it. And then the next object that actually Emily ended up working on was a bridge, because we already had a bridge and we wanted to figure out how these rules would apply to the bridge. Well, you can see it down there, and it kind of curves down. The base of it curves down in the middle, because it was okay, well, we need to include some bowing. But then we started having this question of, why do we have it moving down instead of maybe curling up? Why did we decide for the box to have it curl in instead of curl out, and have this concave versus a convex bowing discussion? And what we decided is that, especially with the bridge, is when you're going on the bridge, it feels more open when you have everything going out, and when it's convex curving. And we even and we have the planks even sinking down a little bit in the center, so that way it feels more open, it feels more inviting for the player to go in. But then if you go back up to the box, we kind of compact it in by having the concave bowing instead. And by having it go in, it compacts it in, but it also kind of says, no, this is my space. You aren't allowed in here.
Yeah, I like the way that Gavin kind of put that out, is that by the direction of the bowing is a subtle invitation, or whatever the opposite of invitation is, like rejection?
A rejection.
I guess, that's fair.
It's an invitation or it's a rejection. And so we were even talking about, we have a barrel that we're planning on that the player can go in and hide in. But even the barrel is curved out like this. And so instead, which is like, hey, come inside, come and hide out here.
Yeah, like it's a safe space.
Yeah, so that's something that we're thinking about, and so it started to instruct how we decide where to have these lines curl and curve.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of how we build our objects. And so up next, we actually ended up going back to the forest images done by Jeremy, and like we said, with the bottom right one, we're like, we want layers, layers, and it shows up in the top left one with the posts, and that hey, there's layers everywhere in the environment, so we should be able to figure out where those can go in objects, in the UI, and characters.
And can I point out that image that you show here is the same scene as the other one that we had earlier, but now this would be not under the snow.
Yep.
And so that becomes a big deal, how we handle snow.
We've actually been very purposely designing the level as if it wasn't in winter, and then adjusting it to be in winter.
Yeah.
Because it was like, we want to make sure we get this right, and by designing it specifically for winter first, then we don't have anything we don't know if it's got enough life, basically.
Yeah.
We don't know how much life it would have, how much plant life this should be and looking like without.
The notion that summer is sort of the truest version of every environment, the most full, the most alive, and that other seasons are either on its way to summer, on its way from summer. That was kind of a way to get our minds in, like, what is the honest version of this scene.
Yep.
Maybe honest is not the right word, but you get the idea.
Here's the baseline, and everything else changes around summer.
Yeah.
So that, and with summer, we don't have to deal with snow or fall leaves or rainstorms or anything like that in the same way.
Yeah.
So going back to layers, we decided layers should be everywhere, not just in environments. And going back to the bark texture, like, you can see that the bark itself weaves in and out of itself, but even the texture was built around layers. It started off with a hand-painted one, which you can see on the right, and then on the left, we ended up adding a real bark texture and overlaying it to add some of the subtle details that it's just like, hey, there's actually like multiple layering within the actual file for this.
Yeah, and I think that happens on every one of the textures we showed too. It's like there's this mostly transparent overlay just to add it. That extra extra thing. It's
not all of them, like the ones we showed earlier. Not all of them have gotten to that stage where we're ready for the texture.
Okay.
But the rock one had it. The pebbles, the stone pebble riverbed one doesn't have that one. The grass is difficult, but
yeah, grass. I don't know what to do with that.
The grass one was like, oh wait, we can't just add a random grass texture in here. We actually have to find one that fits it really well for what we were wanting. But yeah, so the overlay texture has been like, this adds a level of detail to these that otherwise just feels way too smooth and a little fantastical. And as much as but then the other thing is that beyond this, you also find the layering in the objects and in the characters. Specifically with the characters, we were thinking, okay, well, let's add some hair fuzz to them. You guys have seen this picture of Albert before, where he now has a little bit more going on with his face, but his clothing is actually literally layered on top of itself.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you guys a picture later of an earlier version of Albert, and you see where he's wearing the red shirt, the brown pants, and suspenders. Well, he literally we just added on the vest coat.
It made a huge difference. Yeah.
And it just works. And you see in the object, the bottom right, that's the same crate from earlier, just with the texture on it, and now it looks like there's two different types of wood going on in there. And that they are over each other and they're layered on top of each other. And then the texture piece of it, there's highlights and lights layered on top of it, and as well as the actual R. So the texture brings in another level of detail and a level of layering. And even the slide is layered on top of each other because I just decided not to take out. Go with it. I just decided not to take out any imagery here.
Run with that layer thing.
Woo! Layers all the way. So then the next thing we're talking about is the fact that we want to make sure that there's life everywhere. Similar to the idea that there's always a crate in games. There's always been rocks. Rocks are the outside equivalent to crates. It's like we don't want this to look. We don't want rocks to be our default.
Like the lazy choice.
The lazy choice. And especially after visiting Tilcum, we were realizing it's like there weren't many rocks up there. And actually, I don't think we saw any rocks up there. And so we want to make sure we're very intentional about where we place the rocks. And so and when we first made a guideline, it was actually about the rock part of it. We were realizing, let's not have rocks be the focus of this guideline. Let's let the life part of it be the focus.
Yeah.
And so, and beyond that, we started defining what types of life there were. And I'll let Chris continue on that one.
So in the basically in the character definitions, so there's an RPG kind of subsystem going on that in the first game will just barely be there, but you'll see hints of it. But we plan to develop it. And anyways, it goes back to a very old medieval idea that every person is made up of a body, a soul, and a spirit. And there's debates about exactly where those lines get drawn. But in the end, we decided let's really embrace this and bring it into the game. And so life in sort of the Mother Earth, Gaia, like everything green and blowing up and its leaves and cornucopia, that's what we're calling the Soma life. So it's the body sort of the earth, of the creatures. That's one kind of life.
It's life that doesn't have a soul. That's what we have written up here.
Yeah. And so for us, to draw some lines, that would include everything green, everything that's sort of a plant. But it also includes some of the animals like insects and fish, which is for us definitionally an animal without a soul, frankly, is edible. And so this is why you can eat shrimp and you can eat fish, because they don't have a soul, and so no one's feeling really weird about that. You go up a layer to soulish life, and so that would be basically the thing that creates consciousness and personality, and it allows in the real world this would include animals that you might think of as having personality, so like a dog or a horse are thought of sort of as soulish animals, and so in our case that would include any of the other critters, including vermin. Vermin have souls in this regard, and so they can talk and have personalities and everything else. But then the higher level is what's called the pneuma, or the spirit, which is whatever you want to call sort of that divine spark. It's the thing that separates, for example, the vermin from the woodlanders. Is that, and if you want for a definition here, that would be that a creature would need to have a spirit for you to imagine it to be good or evil. And I'll tell you where this works is that when a dog bites you, it may have a soul, but it doesn't have a spirit. And so you don't think of the dog being an evil creature, a good creature. You think about it being as hungry or scared or something like that. So there's this notion that a spirit is this higher level up. And going back to the old medieval notions is that it was the diminution of spirit that led to evil. And so that felt consistent with Jakes' notion that rats aren't evil because they're... Let me do this around. Rats aren't evil because they're rats because they're evil. In other words, that is that their fundamental nature is reflected in their species, not the other way around. And so there's, one of the criticisms that people give occasionally is that they felt like Redwall was racist because all the rats were bad. But Jakes' answer was actually really, really brilliant. I think it's like, no, you got it backwards. And so we wanted to reflect that here. So we have these three kinds of life going on in the character, and we wound up applying that to the environments as well.
And in that case, I'll take over. So we already kind of cover what Soma is. Soma is going to be a lot of what you see in the outside environments and what the majority of this game is going to be showing. But then the Nous life, the soulish life, is going to be very evident in more of the indoor settings, but you still see some Nous life evidence in the top image, specifically because there's these very purposeful stairs and also the posts. That's not there because they grew there. That's there because someone placed it there.
Like a mind created it.
Something with a mind, something with personality, purposely put that thing there. And you start to see evidence of life, despite there's no characters in either of these images, that there's evidence of purposeful, intentional life. So that's kind of like the distinction there. We're going to call Nous life more of the intentional placement. And also one of the other things we're thinking about in terms of guidelines is that pneuma life is actually mostly going to come through our use of light and what we call God rays, which those are when you have the window with all this like that spectacular beam of light that's coming out that has like little dust specks coming through. That's kind of like what I'm talking about with the God rays.
Yeah.
You also see it, and we also see it with how our planning for the UI, the user interface to be looking, and how that is in, and how the player uses that.
Right.
So that's kind of a little bit of our definition for our life and how we're interpreting that for how we go about the game and making the game.
But I think that the point is like, as a fundamental notion, the idea that life is everywhere and has colonized everything becomes, I think it's one of the things that sets Redwall apart, is that even in the darkest times, even in the darkest situations, it's remarkable their willingness to sit down and have a feast or whatever else. Like, life is so evident and apparent even in the most dim circumstances, and it really sets the Woodlanders from the vermin apart, is their willingness and to embrace life at every turn. And so we felt it was really characteristic of the whole Redwall world.
Yep. And it also makes those places that don't have life, like, oh gosh, what's the name of the place that was the old abbey before Redwall?
Cotier?
No, not Cotier. That's the castle. Yeah. Talking about the other abbey that the abbess... Lomehedge. Got the name. When they go back to Lomehedge, that place is barren. That place is near dead. And it's very stark contrast to what everything else is after there's no life. And so it makes those places that don't have life there very, very powerful.
Really stand out. Yeah.
They really stand out because of that. And so it was one of those things that we want to use and so places that wouldn't have life, or we want to be very intentional about where those places are. So then the last thing we're going to talk about primarily is then how our characters have changed in design. Starting off with Sophia, this is, you can kind of see that here's a concept of Sophia, the very first concept, not the first concept, but our final first concept of her. And then our first model of her. And then what we were using before this conversation of the style came in, what we were using is called Imperial Shader. It's a fur shader. It adds like just a fuzziness to them. And it honestly didn't really do much in terms of like adding it in. It became a bit more of a hassle than actually like...
It's a huge hassle.
It was a huge hassle.
It argues with every other shader.
Yes. Yes. Anyway, we won't go into that too much. But this is where we were about 2 months ago with our main character, Sophia. And we mentioned earlier that we got some outside feedback. And one of the pieces of feedback was that Sophia, despite her clothing looks like the original concept, but her face doesn't. And she's also a brown mouse versus a gray mouse. Like, we don't know why. And it was just like, but she doesn't have those little fur tufts that give her a little bit more distinct personality. It was just like, what happened there? It's like, oh, well, we were planning on using this one thing that kind of prevented us from adding those fur things in. And it was like, we had reasons why, but they weren't the strongest of reasons. And that's when after getting that feedback, we were like, well, let's cut out that shader and just not have to deal with it anymore. It makes me much happier as a character designer. I have a lot more freedom now.
Yeah, I know. It's funny that the first shader's interesting thing is we just sort of assumed that you had to have it, but the more we played with it, it added very little to the game, and it was incredibly expensive just from a processing perspective, and it's a huge hassle.
And hours, yes. There's a couple different things that were just issues with it, and what we did next was we started looking at this, and especially like looking at our current the style guides, how they apply to it. This was what you see on the right is a paint over, trying to match the model we had to what we wanted outside of the color fur change. And it was just like, we just need to add some fur tufts along her cheeks and on her head and on the ears. That seems reasonable. Also give her eyelashes. That was actually a big deal, because the top, like her concept has eyelashes in it. It's like, oh, why aren't they there in her model?
Well, and her eyes in the art, they're so alive.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're more alive than what we got right now. It was just fine, but like this just helped. And so we were doing this and ended up going through the modeling phase, and we're realizing, oh wait, we need to figure out the back of the hair. The back of the hair, like we got the front part piece, but what does the back look like? So you can see like an in progress model on the right. You can see on the left. Here's a bunch of different hair designs, and then here's some like, what would it look like with short hair? What would beads or like hair pieces look like, especially on mice? And so we had fun. They took pictures of the back of my head since I have short hair right now, like to see how hair layers and how we wanted to stylize that. And like I said, like, actually, I just said the word I was going to say, which was specifically this added a lot of layering to her body, not just through her clothing. And so it brought our guidelines into more than just their clothing style, but also into the character stylization.
As a quick note, because someone's probably going to ask, people loved this exercise on Facebook. They loved it. And so we had so many votes and people really dug it. And I'm pretty certain we're going to add something in here into the game. It's not going to be on the first build, but there was just such a positive response. It's
also one of the things where I was trying to think about what would Sophia wear versus like that, versus why would she as a scout wear pieces when all of her hair is already slicked back? Yeah. Like, is there a reason for it beyond just decorative? And I feel, and she's more of a practical girl. So in my mind, at least in my mind, I'm more resistant to adding it to her. But we're definitely adding like other pieces, like there's a comb in there, or the little headpiece on definitely some of the other characters, and not just the female characters. Like there's plans for doing another exercise like this with male characters as well. And the thing about this is that this excludes hats. Like we haven't even gotten into hats yet.
Yeah, this is just like hair decorations, just trying to make the back of her head more interesting.
And specifically with the back of her head, because she's a playable character, it needs to be more interesting because that's what you look at most of the time. Yeah. But when you have the other characters, the back of their heads don't need to be as interesting because you're looking at the front most of the time. So fun things. So we did all that. This is what we got to. This is what we're working with right now in Engine. And then going back to one of the other things we talked about early on, we talked about how we wanted to have this rim lighting where it has highlight, this like a light blue, or like we really liked that at the very beginning. We talked about that. Well, we started working on a shader that gives an orange lighting, or like an orangish warm color light on one side, and then a blue on the other. And you can't really see. You can kind of see the blue a little bit. I'm going to try and.
You can see it on her head pretty well.
You can see it on the head. I'm going to see if I can get the mouse. Where is the mouse?
And around her neck, you can see it.
There. You can see it right there, and you can see it right here, or right here. And so those pieces, like this is what we're working with in game right now. This is what we're planning on having. It may not be our exact. We might do a couple more touch-ups, but this is our really close to final Sophia. We're really excited about that.
Something that's just interesting about the rim lighting shader is it's also spatially dynamic. So there was something that Aaron mentioned early on about using light as a cue to where to go, like so it's like drawing you forward between the contrast between light and dark. And this shader becomes part of that. Is that by and large we can just move basically where the shader is aimed dynamically, and so as the warm light will actually guide you towards your goal in a really subtle, easy way. But it was actually some pretty interesting tech. So good job, Gavin.
Yeah. So we're still figuring out some of the details of that otherwise, but it's one of those things like, yeah, we really like this idea, and we're getting hey, let's give an outline to them, more of an illustrative thing, but doing it in color, we'd love that. Yeah. So now for the Albert comparison, which I'm a little bit embarrassed about the first image, the first model, because I was lazy. You can see we've improved him a lot. On the left is a model, on the right is actually just a paint over. He has yet to be modeled in this sense. But you can see his hair was flat. He didn't have any interesting features other than he was gray. He has this gray colored fur that changes from space to space. But he doesn't have a mustache. And he was created at a time when we were thinking, oh, we're using imperial fur. Right. We're going to use this one shader that we decided to nix. Well, then I was also looking at him, and it was like, and we were looking at this model after working on Sophia, and we're like, he is not interesting, and he's supposed to be a tailor, so he should have these interesting clothing pieces.
Instead, he looks like he's from Duck Dynasty or something, right?
He looks, yeah, he doesn't quite
give him a banjo, and he's on someone's porch.
Yeah, so we ended up I worked on a couple different hairstyles for him. I actually came up with what I wanted to add to the concept without moving away from what I'd already worked on. I wouldn't have to redo his shirt completely. What I'm planning on doing for this is just adding a part to the model. I'm literally giving him a jacket or waistcoat. Yeah. And then just expanding out his belly bit, because right now it's really flat. And in the concept I have there, I don't want it to be flat.
And I love the neck scarf thing. I think that's a great detail too. Mm-hmm.
It's really fun. He obviously has a lot more personality now. You can kind of tell a little bit more about what he does, what he feels like, and yeah. So that's something that we're looking at. Yeah. And this is kind of like, again, applying all these different guidelines to not only our environments, not only our objects or textures, but also our characters.
It's worth pointing out that this left model was, I don't know, many months old. And once we had started to nail down the guidelines, as the time it took to go from, oh, here's the things that we actually want to accomplish to this model was like an hour. I mean, maybe 2 to get it done, but once you had something, a target, it was so quick to find it.
Like figuring out, like once, like it's also another example of that is once we figured out the style guides and like some of these guidelines we wanted to make sure we were following, and we were also like half working them out through like exploring textures. We had that bark texture, so then we ended up tackling a water texture or like the grass texture, and we started getting these ideas like, and while like finalizing them and polishing them it takes a little bit longer. Getting the base idea down, like, yeah, we like that. Yeah. We want to keep going with this, and we want to follow through with this. That became a lot quicker. So
we invested a lot of time in this document, but it's already proven to be. It actually increases our efficiency by a lot.
Yep. Like we had originally when we were looking at the crate took I think about a day to figure out overall because it was the first object that we wanted to apply the style guidelines to. We were figuring out how to do that. And then we took that and we started looking at the ladder and we were like, which we haven't shown here. And so we have this ladder and it's like, oh, how do we tackle this? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, we did this, this, and this in the crate. These things can be applied here, here, and here.
Yeah, so, and that was one where once you had it, like I think Emily went through, I don't know, 15 iterations on the ladder in 5 minutes. And kind of settled it down in another 30. Like all of a sudden it started to go really fast.
Yep. Like it just increased what we were able to do because now we have stuff like, does this adhere to what we want? Yep. Yes, no. We actually we know what our point on the map is.
Right.
So this is our last thing that we have visually to show. So I'm going to move on to the last slide, but I know you want to talk about gritty.
Oh yeah. Okay. So
actually, before we go to that, I'll just leave it here.
So I just want to mention one of the things that came up in that I mentioned about a month ago, that Facebook post. There's at least one gentleman, but I think there was more who. How do I say this? There's an awareness that within the Redwall books there is also, frankly, like there's a whole violent dark side to it, and it would be, I think, a mistake if we made everything in this game just kind of all pretty and fun and Zelda. Like that would not be, I think, true to the book. However, what we wanted to decide to do is that that element of, frankly, of darkness and everything else is going to show up more in the actions, in the activity, in the characters, in the rats and scum snout and this kind of stuff, that is going to show up specifically as opposed to globally. And so we tried to figure out what's the major theme, what's the minor theme, and we were convinced that the major theme in Redwall is life. It's not violence. Like violence is definitely the minor theme that comes in and sort of interrupts, but it's not dominant. And that to me is very different from there's a lot of games that really focus on the darkness, and there's gunge everywhere, and there's litter everywhere, and there's dirt maps everywhere, and that becomes a dominant theme. Is frankly the darkness, and we wanted to be the opposite of that. We wanted life to be the dominant theme. So I don't want to give the impression that there's going to be that this is all just a big cotton candy fest. The darkness and frankly the violence that is from the books, it's going to be in the game. It's just it doesn't show up in the environment. Like that needs to be the thing that stands out as what doesn't fit. It's one of these things doesn't belong kind of thing. So that's why a lot of what you've seen in this discussion is primarily on how do we capture that notion of life, the major theme, and that's all I have to say about that.
I'm glad you have a lot to say. At this point, I don't think I have anything else to follow up with.
Okay.
We have questions written down by Emily that were written down by you guys here, so we can actually start answering some of those.
Yeah, I guess we've been running our mouth the whole time.
Yeah, we kind of just ignored you guys, just went our own way. No, we haven't been ignoring. We knew we were going to take your questions eventually. So we'll start with the first thing asked by Nova. Will you release an art book related to the game that would contain everything you've talked about?
Short answer is yes.
Yeah, we would love to.
Well, we are obligated to.
Yes, and we're obligated to. So yes, that is coming. So
yes, the Kickstarter was one of the rewards. We're probably going to open that up for other people too, because it was a popular product. I guess that's a short answer. Yes, and it will be available to more people if you missed the Kickstarter.
Wilder asked if there's any update on the early access release.
The update, and so I hope you don't mind me being coy. The short answer is I can't say much, but we are making progress. And I've got the legal guy giving me the nod, like we're okay, I think. So I can't say a lot, but it's all going well. It's just paperwork stuff, so please don't take it as a slowdown in production or anything. It's I think when it all comes out and we can kind of share the news, I think you'll be happy.
Sammy asks, what is the aeronautical wind speed of an unladen Spara?
African or European? See? You got to know these things when you're king.
Wilder asks, are there going to be any references to the environment of Britain? The Cascades are great for inspiration, but Brian was British and his settings felt that way.
So short answer is yes. The Oregon landscape is similar to England in a lot of ways. So it's one of the reasons why I can go outside, and what we're looking at, both in the terms of the environment itself and the kinds of trees, there's a very lot in common. That said, you're right. Like, it's a British landscape, not an Oregonian landscape. So we're always trying to cleave. And I think we had this question about aspens. I don't know that aspens are native to England, but birches are, and so they're similar. Yeah. And so we can kind of use one as a model for the other.
We have we have a whole list of trees and bushes that are native to England, that we're making sure we're using those as our reference point for the actual trees we're making versus ones that are found in Oregon.
Right.
Like, I remember looking at, and we've looked at species that are available in like species of animals beyond, like what kind of birds are found there versus for like even like what noises are going to be like as our like surround sounds, like what can be found here versus like at night. We talked about fireflies actually, and it's like, is there an option for like a winter firefly
or even European fireflies? So frankly, I didn't ask. I don't know if there's.
So it's like we would love to include fireflies, but we haven't done the research to see if they live in Britain.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, we don't know. We can't answer. So it's like, yes, we're making sure that the environment is true to Britain. We're just but like we said, we're taking inspiration from Oregon.
Yeah. I do want to say, like, I don't think there's any desire on anybody's part to make it slavishly British. Mm-hmm. More like a guidance kind of thing. And so there was going to be some times I think you can expect that we'll take some artistic license in that regard. Just we're going to be careful about it. And so by and large, we want it to be British.
Mm-hmm. Nova asks if there's any estimate of how much area is available on the map. Like, as an example, Abercroft is approximately 16 square kilometers.
Oh. Well, okay, so in the whole first game, I am moving from Lily Grove to Redwall. And so that is a stretch of ground that's probably about 30 to 40 kilometers, but it's sort of in a line, so it's not a square. So it's a longer distance, but I don't think you get to travel every square of it. So in some ways more, in some ways less on this first release, but the notion is to keep expanding that and exploring that. I will say you get some bonus points by the fact that that over the course of the different episodes, you get to explore the same space more than once in different seasons with different characters.
So then Nova also asks, will clothing be available to customize or purchase for playable characters? And for this first one, I'm probably going to say, Chris might correct me on this, but probably not. Especially for this first episode where you're playing a distinct character who already has clothing reflecting their said role in their community, like in their clothing specific to their role, their job, and they don't have an opportunity to go shop. You aren't going to. You're not going to go and shop for things actually. Yeah. So in this case, especially for this first episode, I don't think there is.
No, you're right. And I'll say, Nova, like, this is probably one of the things that we hear. One of the most requested features is like a really robust character creation system, and I would love to have that. But those systems are incredibly expensive, just in terms of assets and people, and so we have to make some choices. And so right now, that's out of play. But if all of a sudden we've got 700 people on staff, then that would be like near the top of our list of things we'd love to add.
Yeah, it's one of those things like, we would love to make this work.
Yeah.
Just can't. Then the last thing that's asked by Wilder is that, will cooking be featured in this episode?
Yes.
Yes. So that's the questions that we got written down. I hope if you guys wrote down anything else, we might have missed it. Since getting this one at least, we might have missed it. I apologize for that. We might need someone else who's looking at the chat right now to tell us if we missed anything else.
How are we on time, by the way? Where are we? Hey, Sammy, what time is it? Okay, so we're about out of time anyway.
Yeah. So perfect. Okay. Thank you, Sammy. So we really appreciate you guys coming and joining us for our 5th art talk.
Is that right?
I think it's our 5th art talk specifically. At least according to how many different PowerPoint presentations I found. So, thank you guys for joining us. We really appreciated it. We appreciate being able to have time to go through this stuff with you, even though it's mostly just us blabbering on and on.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
I realize this is hopefully no one's missed this, but I just wanted to announce something that might have just gone live, Emily.
Yep.
Okay, just went live on Facebook. We're going to run a pumpkin carving contest. So we thought this would be a fun thing for Halloween, and the details are on the Facebook page if you haven't seen it. The bottom line is there's going to be 2 age groups, basically kids and older from not so young kids. And we just if you're going to make a pumpkin, we would love to see your Redwall themed pumpkins. And we'll do a first kind of an internal sifting of what we think are our 10 best. Then we'll let you guys vote out of the 10 top ones on which one you like, and we'll put the winners as can actually be in the game. And so we can put your pumpkin in the game and visible on that probably on Lily Grove is probably where it'll show up. So check that out, and we'll be running that I think through the end of next week, through the 28th or so. And hope you enjoy it.